My name is Jake Miller, and for the past 5 years, I've been a park ranger at the Appalachian National Park. It's a dream job for a guy like me who's always felt more at home amongst the trees than in the concrete jungle. Most of my days are spent hiking trails, assisting lost or injured visitors, and generally making sure everyone respects the park's natural beauty and rules. You see a lot of interesting characters out here, from seasoned hikers attempting the entire 290-mile trail to weekend warriors looking for a quick escape. Most of the stories I could tell you are pretty mundane: someone forgetting their bear canister, a sudden downpour leading to a sprained ankle, or the occasional overly friendly deer. But there are other stories too, ones that don't quite fit into the official park reports. Stories that linger in the air like a cold fog, tales whispered around campfires by long-distance hikers, and warnings passed down from older rangers, stories about things unseen, unexplained occurrences that make even the most rational among us sleep with one eye open. This particular incident started like any other routine task. It was late October, the tail end of the hiking season. The leaves were mostly off the trees, painting the forest floor in shades of brown and gold, and the air had that crisp, clean bite that comes just before the real cold sets in. We'd received a report of a fallen tree blocking a lesser-used section of the AT, about 10 miles north of the Pine Mountain Trail junction. It wasn't an immediate emergency, but protocol dictated that we clear it before it became a hazard to any late-season hikers. My usual partner, Sarah, was down with the flu, so I drew the short straw and was tasked with the solo trek. I'm no stranger to being alone in the woods. In fact, I often prefer it. There's a certain peace that comes with the solitude, a chance to truly connect with the wilderness around you. The location of the fallen tree was near an old ranger outpost, a small, dilapidated cabin that hadn't been actively used in years. It was marked on the older maps, but most of the newer ones simply showed the general area. I knew it was there, of course. Every ranger who's been on the force for more than a year knows about the old Miller cabin. Not because it holds any historical significance or architectural merit, but because of the stories. Whispers of strange lights flickering in the windows when no one was supposed to be there, odd noises echoing from the surrounding woods, and a general feeling of unease that seemed to cling to the area like the persistent scent of damp earth. Most of us dismissed it as folklore, the product of overactive imaginations fueled by long nights and the isolation of the backcountry. I'd always been a skeptic myself. I believed in what I could see, what I could touch, what could be logically explained. But the woods have a way of testing your beliefs. I set off early that morning, the rising sun casting long shadows through the skeletal branches of the trees. My pack was light, containing the necessary tools for clearing the tree, along with my standard emergency kit, some food, and a radio. The hike-in was uneventful. The air was still and quiet, save for the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves and the occasional scolding chatter of a squirrel. I reached the reported location of the fallen tree around midday. It was a large oak, probably taken down by a recent windstorm. It lay across the trail like a fallen giant, its thick trunk effectively blocking passage. It took me a couple of hours of hard work with the chainsaw and an axe to clear a path. The rhythmic roar of the saw and the sharp crack of the axe biting into wood were the only sounds for miles. By the time I was done, the afternoon sun was starting to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I consulted my map. The old Miller cabin was less than a mile further up the trail. According to the park regulations, in situations like this, where a ranger is working late in a remote area and the return trip would involve hiking in the dark, they are authorized to utilize any available shelter. Officially, the Miller cabin was off limits for overnight stays due to its state of disrepair. But unofficially, it was known that rangers occasionally used it in emergencies or when caught out late. I wasn't exactly in an emergency, and I still had a few hours of daylight left, but the thought of hiking back the 10 miles in the gathering darkness wasn't particularly appealing, especially with the temperature starting to drop. I made the decision to head to the cabin. I figured I could spend the night, get an early start in the morning, and be back at headquarters by mid-morning. It seemed like the most sensible option. As I continued along the trail, a subtle shift seemed to occur in the atmosphere. The woods, which had been merely quiet before, now felt still, almost unnaturally so. Birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustling of small animals in the undergrowth was absent. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under my boot. It was the kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind that whispers of unseen eyes watching you from the shadows. The trail narrowed and began to climb slightly. Through the thinning trees, I could now make out the faint outline of the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, looking even more dilapidated than the stories had suggested. The log walls were weathered and grey, with patches of moss clinging to the north-facing side. Several of the windows were broken or boarded up, giving it a blind, vacant stare. The roof sagged in places, and the stone chimney leaned precariously to one side. It definitely looked like it had seen better days, decades ago. As I approached the cabin, the feeling of unease intensified. It wasn't just the physical appearance of the place, there was something else, an almost palpable sense of wrongness. The air around the cabin felt colder, heavier. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone else around. I told myself it was just my imagination. The story's getting to me after all. It was just an old, abandoned cabin in the woods. Nothing to be afraid of. I pushed open the creaking wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was just as I expected, dark, dusty, and neglected. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. A single, dusty window let in a sliver of the fading daylight, illuminating a small, sparsely furnished room. There was a rickety wooden table in the center, covered in a thick layer of dust and a few scattered rodent droppings. 2 crude wooden chairs stood beside it, one of which looked like it might collapse if you sat on it. In one corner, there was a rusty wood burning stove, its flue choked with cobwebs. Against the far wall, a narrow cot with a stained and tattered mattress lay, slumped against the logs. The silence inside was even more profound than outside. It pressed in on me, amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I took a few steps further into the room, my boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. It was definitely creepy, no doubt about it, the kind of place that sent shivers down your spine, even in broad daylight. But it was shelter, and right now, that was all that mattered. I set down my pack and started to make myself as comfortable as possible. I swept some of the debris off the table and laid out my food. I checked the wood stove, half expecting to find a family of raccoons living inside, but it was empty. There was some dry firewood stacked in a corner, probably left by some previous, equally pragmatic ranger. That was a welcome sight. A fire would definitely make this place feel less oppressive. As the last rays of sunlight faded, and the woods outside plunged into darkness, I got a small fire going in the stove. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the already unsettling cabin feel even more alive. I sat on one of the chairs, leaning back against the surprisingly sturdy frame, and ate my meager dinner of a cold sandwich and an apple. The silence outside was now punctuated by the hooting of an owl, a sound that usually brought me comfort but tonight felt strangely ominous. After eating, I decided to try and get some rest. The cot looked less than inviting, but I unrolled my sleeping bag and laid it out. The mattress was lumpy and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was better than sleeping on the hard floor. I lay down, pulling my sleeping bag around me, and stared up at the dark ceiling. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers, and the only light came from the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty window. The cabin creaked and groaned in the stillness of the night, the sounds amplified by the surrounding silence. Every rustle outside, every sigh of the wind through the trees, sent a jolt of unease through me. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest at night, the old cabin settling. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. The stories, the feeling of being watched, the unnatural silence of the woods, it all started to coalesce into a growing sense of foreboding. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my mind and drift off to sleep, but sleep was elusive. My senses felt heightened, every nerve on edge. I listened intently to the sounds outside, trying to discern any pattern, any sign of something out of the ordinary. And then I heard it, a sound that wasn't the wind, wasn't an animal. It was a faint scratching, coming from the wall just beside my head. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it just a mouse? This place was probably riddled with rodents, but the scratching didn't sound like a mouse. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was as if something was trying to claw its way in. The scratching stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence again. Then a new sound began, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the far corner of the room. The corner where the shadows were deepest, where the faint moonlight didn't reach. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The shuffling continued, growing slightly louder, and then I heard a soft whimper. My blood ran cold. A whimper. What kind of animal would whimper like that? It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It sounded almost human. I fumbled for my flashlight on the ground beside the cot, my hand shaking. I flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, and pointed it towards the corner where I'd heard the sound. The beam danced across the dusty floor, across the cobweb, draped walls, and finally settled on the corner. There was nothing there, just shadows. deep, impenetrable shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of my flashlight. I held my breath, listening intently. The shuffling and the whimpering had stopped. The only sound was the faint crackling of the embers in the stove. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The isolation, the stories, the creepy atmosphere, it was all getting to me. I was a rational person. There had to be a logical explanation for what I'd heard. But as I lay back down on the cot, the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. I couldn't shake the image of those dark shadows in the corner, the faint, almost human whimper echoing in my mind. Sleep was definitely out of the question now. I had a long night ahead of me, alone in this creepy cabin in the middle of the Appalachian wilderness. And something told me that the night was only just beginning. The beam of my flashlight sliced through the oppressive darkness, revealing nothing but dust motes dancing in the air. The corner remained stubbornly vacant, the shadows clinging to it like a shroud. I held my breath, my senses straining for any repetition of the sounds I'd heard. Silence. Only the faint crackle of the cooling embers in the stove and the rhythmic thumping of my own heart filled the small space. I lowered the flashlight, a bead of sweat trickling down my temple. Had I imagined it? Was the isolation and the folklore finally getting to me? It wouldn't be the first time a ranger had reported strange happenings in the backcountry, only to have them attributed to stress and fatigue. I decided to try and rationalize what I'd heard. The scratching could have been a branch scraping against the wall in the wind, though there wasn't any noticeable breeze outside. As for the whimper-well, that was harder to explain. Maybe a distressed animal had gotten trapped under the cabin. That seemed plausible, though the almost human quality of the sound still lingered uncomfortably in my mind. Despite my attempts at logic, a prickle of unease remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this cabin, but something was watching me from the darkness. I pulled my knife from its sheath, the cold steel reassuring in my trembling hand. It was a standard-issue ranger knife, sturdy and reliable, more intended for cutting rope or preparing kindling than fighting off whatever might be out there, but it was better than nothing. I remained sitting on the edge of the cot, my back against the wall, the flashlight clutched tightly in my other hand. My gaze darted around the small room, constantly scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that my senses hadn't been playing tricks on me. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of my watch seeming deafening in the silence. The fire in the stove eventually died out completely, leaving the room bathed in the faint, ethereal glow of the moonlight filtering through the dirty window pane. Just as I was starting to convince myself that I'd overacted, that the sounds had been nothing more than my imagination running wild, I heard it again. The scratching? This time it was clearer closer. It seemed to be coming from the wall directly behind the head of the cot, just inches from my ear. It was a frantic, desperate scratching, like something trapped and trying to escape. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't the sound of a branch. This was something else. Something alive. I pressed my ear against the rough log wall, straining to hear more. The scratching continued for a few moments, then stopped abruptly. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, my knife held ready. Then a new sound emerged from the wall. A soft, whispering sound. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was definitely there. It sounded like voices. Muffled, indistinct, as if several people were whispering just on the other side of the logs. I couldn't make out any words, just the sibilant murmur of hushed tones. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a trapped animal. This was something far more disturbing. Who would be whispering in the walls of an abandoned cabin in the middle of the night? And how could I hear them so clearly through the thick logs? I scrambled off the cot, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept it across the walls. There were no visible cracks or openings, nothing that could explain the sounds. The logs were tightly fitted together, chinked with dried mud and moss. It was an old structure, but it was solid. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from all around me now, from within the very fabric of the cabin itself. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Suddenly, one of the whispers seemed to detach itself from the general murmur. It was still faint, but I could almost make out a word. It sounded like my name, Jakey. The whisper was soft, breathy, like someone speaking directly into my ear. I recalled, stumbling backwards, my heart hammering against my ribs. Had I really heard that? My name? Who could possibly know my name out here? The whispering intensified, the hushed voices swirling around me, each one seeming to whisper my name. Jakey, Jakey, Jake. It was a chorus of ghostly voices, a cacophony of whispers that sent shivers down my spine. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the sound, But it was no use. The whispers seemed to be inside my head now, echoing in the silent chambers of my mind. Panic began to set in. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some animal or the wind. This was something else, something I couldn't explain, something supernatural. The stories of the Miller cabin flooded my mind, the strange lights, the odd noises, the feeling of unease. I had dismissed them as folklore, but now, standing in the middle of this whispering cabin, I wasn't so sure. I had to get out of here. I had to escape this place. I turned towards the door, my hand reaching for the latch, but then I heard a new sound. A low, guttural moan, coming from the corner where I had seen the shadows earlier. It was a sound of immense pain and suffering, a sound that made my stomach churn. I froze, my hand hovering over the latch. Curiosity and a sense of professional responsibility warred with my growing terror. As a park ranger, it was my duty to investigate any signs of distress, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this cabin as possible. The moaning continued, growing louder, more agonizing. It sounded like someone or something was in terrible pain. I couldn't just ignore it. I had to at least check. Taking a deep breath, I slowly turned back towards the corner, my flashlight beam fixed on the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there? Are you hurt?" Silence. The moaning had stopped as abruptly as it had started. Only the whispers remained, swirling around me like unseen entities. I took a tentative step towards the corner, my knife held out in front of me. The shadows seemed to deepen as I approached, the darkness becoming almost palpable. I swept my flashlight beam around, trying to penetrate the gloom, but I could see nothing. "Hello," I called out again, my voice louder this time, trying to project an air of confidence I didn't feel. "If you're hurt, I can help." Still no response. Just the whispers and the oppressive silence that followed the moaning. I hesitated, my mind racing. Was this some kind of trick? Was something trying to lure me into the darkness? Against my better judgment, I took another step forward. The air in this corner felt colder, heavier, as if a malevolent presence was lurking just out of sight. The whispers seemed to grow more frantic, their hushed tones taking on a sharper, more urgent quality. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. It was a clammy, fated breath that sent a wave of nausea washing over me. I spun around, my flashlight beam swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space behind me. The whispering reached a fever pitch, the voices now sounding like they were right in my ear, their words still indistinguishable, but their intent undeniably hostile. I felt a cold, skeletal finger brush against my cheek. I recoiled, stumbling backwards, my flashlight clattering to the floor and plunging the cabin into darkness. Panic seized me. I couldn't see, I could only hear the relentless whispers swirling around me, feel the phantom touches on my skin. I scrambled blindly for the door, my hands flailing in the darkness. I could hear the shuffling sound again, closer this time, and the soft whimpering, now laced with a hint of something else, something predatory. My hand finally found the latch, and I yanked it open, stumbling out into the night. The sudden rush of cold air against my face was a shock, but it was a welcome one. Anything was better than the suffocating darkness and the whispering voices of that cabin. I didn't stop to look back. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, my boots pounding on the uneven ground, the branches whipping at my face in the darkness. The whispers seemed to follow me, their faint murmur still audible in the night air, but they were receding, growing fainter with every step I took. I didn't dare to slow down. I kept running, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, until I finally burst out of the trees and onto the main trail. The familiar path, bathed in the soft glow of the moon, was a welcome sight. It felt like I had escaped some kind of nightmare. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I looked back towards the direction of the cabin, but all I could see were the dark shapes of the trees against the moonlit sky. The whispers were gone now, replaced by the normal sounds of the forest at night, the chirping of crickets, the hooting of an owl in the distance. Had it all been real, or had I simply succumbed to fear and exhaustion? I didn't know. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not tonight, not ever. I pulled out my radio, my hand still shaking, and contacted dispatch. I reported the strange occurrences, trying to sound as calm and rational as possible. I knew they would likely attribute it to stress or fatigue, but I needed to document what had happened. After a brief conversation, they agreed to send another ranger out in the morning to check on the cabin. I told them I would wait for them at the trailhead. The hike back felt long and arduous. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, something from the whispering cabin. I finally reached the trailhead just as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I sat down on a bench, leaning my head in my hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away: stress, imagination, the power of suggestion. But the memory of the whispers, the cold breath on my neck, the feeling of being watched, those felt all too real. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light on the surrounding forest, I saw the familiar sight of another park ranger approaching. It was Sarah, looking much better than she had a few days ago. What happened? Dispatch said you had some kind of incident, she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I looked at her familiar face, her reassuring presence, and for the first time since the whispering started, I felt a sliver of relief. Sarah, I said, my voice hoarse, you wouldn't believe what happened at the Miller cabin. I recounted the events of the previous night to Sarah, my voice still raspy with exhaustion and a lingering tremor of fear. I told her about the unnatural silence of the woods leading up to the cabin, the dilapidated state of the building, the scratching in the walls, and then the whispers. I described the soft, hushed voices that seemed to surround me, the feeling of cold breath on my neck, and the disembodied touch on my cheek. Finally, I told her about the low, guttural moan that had sent me fleeing into the darkness. Sarah listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to skepticism as my story progressed. She's a grounded, no-nonsense kind of person, not easily swayed by spooky tales. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on a distant point in the woods. Jake, she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. You know I trust you, but that sounds unbelievable. You were tired, working alone, it was late in the season. Maybe you just had a bad dream, or something you misinterpreted. I shook my head vehemently. That wasn't a dream, Sarah. I was wide awake. I heard it, I felt it. The whispers, they were calling my name. Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. Okay. Let's think this through. The cabin's been abandoned for years. It's probably full of old mice, maybe even bats. The wind could have been making strange noises through the cracks in the walls. As for the moan, could have been an injured animal. It didn't sound like an animal, Sarah. I insisted. It sounded like someone in terrible pain. And the whispers, they weren't the wind, they were voices. I know what I heard. Sarah nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. All right, well, let's go take a look. Maybe we can find some kind of explanation. I hesitated. The thought of returning to that cabin filled me with dread. But I knew Sarah wouldn't believe me unless she saw it for herself. And a part of me, a small stubborn part, wanted to prove that I hadn't just imagined it all. We started hiking back towards the location of the Miller cabin, the morning sun now fully risen, casting long shadows through the trees. The woods seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but still holding a lingering sense of unease. The silence I had noticed the previous evening was gone, replaced by the cheerful chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. As we approached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The cabin looked even more forlorn in the bright light of day, its weathered walls and broken windows telling a story of years of neglect. We cautiously approached the cabin, the wooden door hanging slightly ajar. Sarah pushed it open and stepped inside, followed by me, my hand instinctively reaching for my knife again. The interior looked the same as I remembered it: dusty, dilapidated, and eerily silent. The faint smell of mildew still hung in the air. Sarah surveyed the room, her eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Anything seem out of the ordinary to you? She asked. I pointed to the corner where I had heard the moaning. It was coming from over there, in the shadows. Sarah shone her flashlight into the corner. It was just a dark recess, filled with cobwebs and dust. There was nothing there. She then examined the walls, running her hand along the rough logs. I don't see any holes or cracks that would explain whispers. These logs are pretty solid. She tapped on the wall behind the cot. Hear that? Solid wood. I remembered the frantic scratching I had heard coming from that very spot. It was impossible to explain. Sarah moved over to the wood, burning stove and peered inside. No animals in here. She checked the chimney flue. Looks clear. She spent the next half hour meticulously examining the cabin, looking for any sign of what I had described. She checked for drafts, looked for evidence of animals, even climbed up onto the sagging roof to inspect for damage. But she found nothing. Jake, she said eventually, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. I hate to say it, but there's nothing here. No sign of anything unusual. Are you sure you weren't just stressed out? I felt a surge of anger mixed with disappointment. I knew what I had heard. I hadn't imagined it. But how could I prove it when there was no physical evidence? I know what I experienced, Sarah, I said, my voice firm. There were whispers, I heard them. Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder. Look, I'm not saying you're lying, but maybe your mind played tricks on you. This place has a reputation after all. Maybe that got to you. I sighed. I knew she was trying to be understanding, but her skepticism stung. Okay, I said. But did you feel it? The feeling in the air last night? The silence in the woods? Sarah hesitated for a moment. I didn't hike in here last night, Jake. I was at home, resting, of course. How could she have felt it? We spent another hour searching the area around the cabin, looking for any tracks or signs of unusual activity. We found nothing. The forest floor was covered in fallen leaves, undisturbed except for our own footprints. Eventually, Sarah convinced me that there was nothing more to be found at the cabin. We cleared the area to make sure no hikers would inadvertently stumble upon it, and then we started the long hike back to headquarters. The silence between us on the hike back was heavy. I could feel Sarah's doubt, and it made me question my own sanity. Had I really heard those whispers? Had I really felt that cold breath? Back at the ranger station, I filed a report detailing the fallen tree and my overnight stay at the Miller cabin. I mentioned the strange occurrences, but I phrased it carefully, focusing on the unexplained noises and the feeling of unease. I didn't want to sound crazy. My report was met with the usual polite skepticism. The head ranger, a grizzled veteran named Ben, listened to my account with a knowing look in his eyes. The Miller cabin, huh? He said, leaning back in his chair. Heard a few stories about that place over the years. Nothing ever substantiated, though. Probably just the wind playing tricks. I didn't argue. What was the point? They wouldn't believe me unless they experienced it themselves. For the next few weeks, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I focused on my work, on the familiar routines of patrolling the trails and assisting visitors, but the memory of the whispers lingered in the back of my mind, a constant, unsettling reminder of the night I spent in the Miller cabin. Then, about a month later, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew. It was a cold, overcast day in late November. The hiking season was officially over, and the park was mostly deserted. Sarah and I were on patrol in a different section of the park, near Black Rock Summit, when we received a radio call from dispatch. We've got a situation. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. A group of hikers reported finding something unusual near the old Miller cabin. My blood ran cold. Unusual. What do you mean? I asked, my voice betraying my anxiety. They didn't give many details. The dispatcher replied, just said it looked like some kind of camp, but it was in really bad shape. They also reported a strange smell. Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The Miller cabin. What do you think it could be? I didn't know what to think, but a dark premonition settled over me. We need to go check it out, I said. We drove to the nearest trailhead and then hiked the remaining distance to the Miller cabin. The air grew colder as we approached the clearing, and I could feel that familiar sense of unease creeping back into my consciousness. When we reached the cabin, we found a small group of hikers waiting for us, their faces pale and shaken. They pointed towards a small, overgrown area behind the cabin. It's back there, one of them said, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't want to get too close. Sarah and I exchanged a look and then cautiously approached the area they had indicated. What we found there sent a chill down both our spines. It was a makeshift campsite, crudely constructed from branches and tattered blankets. There was a blackened fire pit in the center, and scattered around it were various items, empty food wrappers, a few dirty articles of clothing, and something else, something much more disturbing. Lying on the ground near the fire pit were several small, crudely made dolls. They were fashioned from sticks and rags, their features drawn on with what looked like charcoal. And each doll had something wrong with it. Some were missing limbs, others had their heads twisted at unnatural angles. They were unsettling, disturbing in a way that I couldn't quite explain. But it was the smell that made my stomach churn. It was a sickly, sweet odor, like rotting meat mixed with something else. Something metallic and acrid. As we continued to examine the campsite, Sarah suddenly gasped. She was kneeling beside a shallow depression in the ground, her face pale with horror. Jakey, look at this. I went over to where she was kneeling and peered into the depression. What I saw made my blood run cold. Scattered within the depression were several small bones. They were too small to be from a deer or a bear. They looked human. My mind reeled. What was going on here? Who had been camping behind the Miller cabin? And what were these bones? Suddenly, we heard a twig snap in the woods behind us. We both spun around, our hands instinctively reaching for our sidearms. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its body draped in rags that looked disturbingly familiar. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see two glowing red eyes staring back at us. A low, guttural moan emanated from the figure, a sound that sent a wave of icy terror through me. It was the same moan I had heard in the cabin. The figure slowly raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal. In its grasp, it held one of the crudely made dolls we had found at the campsite, and then it spoke. Its voice was a raspy whisper, chillingly familiar. Jakey. My blood ran cold at the sound of my name whispered in that raspy, chilling voice. The figure standing at the edge of the trees sent a primal fear coursing through me, a terror unlike anything I had ever experienced in my years as a park ranger. The glowing red eyes seemed to pierce through me, and the sight of the crude doll clutched in its skeletal hand was deeply unsettling. Sarah reacted instantly, drawing her side arm and pointing it towards the figure. "Stay back! Identify yourself!" she yelled, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hand. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, its gaze fixed on me, the whisper of my name echoing softly in the cold air. Jakey. I felt paralyzed by fear, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Who was this creature? What did it want? And how did it know my name? Slowly, the figure began to move, stepping out from the shadows of the trees and into the dim sunlight filtering through the overcast sky. As it moved, I could see more of its form. It was unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs long and spindly, covered in tattered rags that resembled pieces of old clothing. Its face remained hidden in shadow, but the red glow from its eyes was unmistakable. The figure took another step closer, and I noticed something else, a faint, sickly sweet smell emanating from it. The same smell we had detected at the campsite. It was a smell that spoke of decay and something unnatural. Jaker. The whisper came again, closer this time. Suddenly, Sarah fired a warning shot into the ground near the figure's feet. The sound echoed through the silent woods, startling the group of hikers who were still standing nearby. The figure flinched at the sound, its glowing red eyes widening slightly, but it didn't stop advancing. It continued to stare at me, the crude doll still held in its outstretched hand. "Jakey, you shouldn't have stayed in my cabin." The raspy whisper continued. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what it was saying. "Your cabin," I stammered. "This is the Miller cabin. It's been abandoned for years." The figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture that sent a shiver down my spine. "Not abandoned, mine." Terror finally broke through my paralysis. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was no ordinary person. This was the source of the whispers, the moans, the feeling of unease that had permeated the area around the cabin. "Sarah, we need to get out of here," I said urgently, backing away slowly. Sarah kept her weapon trained on the figure, not without knowing what this thing is. The figure took another step closer, and I could now see its face more clearly. Or at least, what passed for a face. It was gaunt and skeletal, the skin stretched tight over sharp bone. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light, and its mouth was a thin, lipless slit that seemed incapable of forming normal words. It was a face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. "You woke me up, Lou." The whisper continued, its tone now laced with a hint of menace. "You disturbed my rest." It raised the crude doll higher, and I felt a sudden wave of nausea. There was something deeply wrong with those dolls, something more than just their unsettling appearance. "What are those dolls?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't answer. It just continued to stare at me, its red eyes burning into my soul. Then it began to move faster, its long, spindly limbs propelling it forward with surprising speed. It lunged towards me, the crude doll outstretched like a weapon. Sarah fired another shot, this time aiming for the figure's leg. The bullet struck home, and the figure stumbled, letting out a pained, guttural sound. But it didn't fall. It just kept coming, its red eyes filled with malevolent intent. I knew we were in serious danger. This thing wasn't human, and bullets didn't seem to stop it. "Run, Sarah!" I yelled, pushing her out of the way as the figure reached me. It swung the crude doll at my face, and I instinctively raised my arm to block it. The doll struck my forearm with surprising force, and a sharp, burning pain shot through my limb. It felt like I had been struck by something much harder than just a stick doll. I stumbled backwards, my knife falling from my grasp. The figure advanced on me, its red eyes glowing with triumph. Suddenly, Sarah was there, hitting the figure from the side with the butt of her rifle. The figure staggered, its attention momentarily diverted. "Jake, get up." Sarah yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the figure. It was still standing, its gaunt frame swaying slightly, but its red eyes were now fixed on Sarah. You will pay for that." The whisper hissed, its voice filled with rage. It turned its attention to Sarah and began to advance on her, its movements jerky and unnatural. We knew we couldn't fight this thing. We had to escape. Let's go, I said, pulling Sarah towards the trail. We turned and ran, our boots pounding on the forest floor. Behind us, we could hear the unnatural sounds of the figure pursuing us, its raspy whispers echoing through the trees. We ran as fast as we could, not daring to look back, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding in our chests. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees becoming a blur as we fled from the terrifying entity that had been lurking behind the Miller cabin. We finally reached the trailhead, where our vehicle was parked. We jumped inside, Sarah fumbling with the keys in her shaking hand. She started the engine, and we sped away, leaving the haunted woods behind us. We didn't stop until we were back at the ranger station, the familiar surroundings offering a small measure of comfort. We reported everything that had happened, our voices still trembling with fear. The other rangers listened with disbelief and concern, their faces pale as we described the gaunt figure with glowing red eyes and the crude, disturbing dolls. The head ranger, Ben, organized a team to go back to the Miller cabin and the campsite. They were armed and prepared for anything, but when they returned later that day, their report was chilling. They found the campsite exactly as we had described it, with the fire pit, the scattered belongings, and the unsettling dolls. They even found the small bones in the depression, which were later confirmed to be human, though they were too old and fragmented to provide any identification. But there was no sign of the figure. No tracks, no indication of where it had gone. It had simply vanished. The Miller cabin was sealed off, declared off limits to everyone. An official investigation was launched, but no logical explanation was ever found for the events we had experienced. Some of the older rangers whispered stories about a tragedy that had occurred at the Miller cabin many years ago, a family lost in the woods, a deranged hermit who had lived in the area. They spoke of restless spirits and dark energies that might still linger in the woods. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that I had seen something terrifying, something that defied explanation. The memory of the whispers, the red glowing eyes, the crude dolls, they would forever be etched into my mind. I continued to work as a park ranger, but I never went back to the area around the Miller cabin. And whenever I hiked alone in the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in the shadows, the gaunt figure with the glowing red eyes was still out there, whispering my name. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I think I can still hear it, a faint, raspy whisper carried on the breeze. Jakey. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that the ranger's nightmare is never truly over. The woods hold secrets, dark and ancient secrets, and sometimes those secrets reach out and touch us, leaving us forever changed by the encounter. The Appalachian Trail, for all its beauty, can also be a place of profound and inexplicable terror. And I, Jake Miller, the park ranger, learned that lesson in the most horrifying way imaginable. The woods are always watching, and some things that dwell within them are best left undisturbed.